Warm welcome everyone to MR-dagarna in Örebro. I hope that everyone is comfortable in this venue and that you're also comfortable maybe perhaps in front of a screen somewhere looking at this webcast. We have a conversation which I look forward to with much anticipation with our guest from Zimbabwe, the distinguished honored guest Winnet Shamuyarira from the organization WoMin, and we will discuss feminist alternatives. My name is Louise Lindfors. I'm Secretary General for Afrikagrupperna, and we have a partnership with WoMin in southern parts of Africa. Winnet will tell you more about the organization's goal and outcomes, but we also want to address the fact that the theme on MR-dagarna this year is human security. And the gender-based violence and the violence against women and the femicides is a pandemic spreading around the globe. It's a context that is visual and a reality here in Sweden as well as in Southern Africa. And in this conversation, Winnet will share a little bit on what the organization WoMin does and how the alternatives looks like to the world order that we're all suffering from, in a sense. A very warm welcome to you, Winnet. Would you mind starting just introducing yourself a little bit more in depth?
Okay, thank you, Louise. I work with WoMin, African Alliance, which is a Pan-Africanist, eco-feminist organization that works in at least 15 African countries. WoMin works with women in communities that are being affected by mega mining and extraction. And WoMin uses an ecofeminist analysis in its work, which is, and we locate the structures of inequality that exist, and we also locate, violence that women experience within a capitalist, mode of production, where men, particularly in this case, Black African men's labor is exploited, and also women's social reproductive labor is exploited. It becomes uncared work, and we then also use that lens to look at how women are impacted in these communities and how violence plays out in these communities, using this very extractive, mode of production, which benefits mostly Western governments and also multinational companies in these communities.
Yes, we'll come back to the structural level of the violence as we speak a little bit more also on the alternatives. But I know that your role is to coordinate militarization and gender-based violence and violence against women. And perhaps you could elaborate a little bit for the audience here on the context. You mentioned it now, how extractivism is linked to the oppression and to the violence on a structural and global level, but also specifically the geopolitical sense in Southern Africa, where there is so high dependency on different minerals, fossil fuels, etc. So this industry and the militarization of this industry has a large impact on people in general, but on women in specific. Could you explain a little bit more on the context so that the general public here in Sweden gets some kind of overview?
Okay, I should start by saying that one of the major things that we do realize is that there is large-scale development projects and mining that is taking place in Southern Africa, and also the realization that these large-scale development projects are not necessarily benefiting the African people. And in the case of mining and extraction that is happening in these communities, when large-scale mining is happening, most of our governments have found themselves going into partnerships with multinational companies and protecting the interests of multinational companies by militarizing, communities where there is mining taking place. And with militarization also comes violence, and women become targets because when mining is happening in most communities, one, there are displacements that take place, communities are moved, and and when communities sometimes say no to mega mining and extraction happening within their communities, they are also faced with a lot of violence and violations. And this is violence that is sometimes perpetrated by private security companies, but it's also violence that is more often than not also perpetrated by the military, who's also protecting the interests of the multinational companies. And in our work as WoMin, we've worked with communities where women become, women's bodies become spaces on which wars then are fought. We have women's bodies, like sexual rape is one of the ways in which, the violence is manifesting in these communities. Women have to walk long distances to get firewood. After displacements, women have to walk long distances to get firewood, to get water, and they are prone to sexual violence. And this violence is normally perpetrated by men with guns who are military men. But also there are communities where security details, in the name of militarization, also then find themselves having to search women's bodies, inserting fingers in women's, private parts, in order for, they say they're looking for diamonds. And these are cases where, they're saying they're protecting actually, the minerals, or they're trying to protect, the minerals, and by so doing, because there's militarization in these spaces, it then becomes very difficult even for people to be mobile. But women then experience violence in very particular way, and sexual violence is one of the ways, one of the many ways that women get to experience violence. There are other violations that women experience or communities experience at large, such as physical violence, but and also violence that is really structural, when people have to walk long distances, when people are dispossessed of their land, when people do not have the right to food sovereignty because they've been dispossessed of their land, or they are now left with land that is not arable because of the mining and extraction happening within their communities.
You mentioned now food sovereignty, which is a key term to understand what is at stake when it comes to both oppression, but also when it comes to the alternatives that we are now here to map out. And if you compare, for instance, there is a term within the UN multilateral language called food security. We hear that a lot. We talk about poor countries and food distribution, and how can we make the food be enough for the African continent, for instance, even though we know that the African continent alone produces more than 5 times more than that would be enough to feed all the citizens in that continent. What could you explain more about the food sovereignty? What's in that concept that sort of stands out when you compare it to food security? Why isn't food sovereignty something just humanitarian or something, help service? What is it about food sovereignty?
Okay, so I think one of the key things that we need to understand is the fact that we have relied on agriculture for a very long time. And then we also have indigenous ways of farming. We have indigenous seeds that have sustained communities. And with that also comes, a sense of food that, a sense of, one, belonging, but also a sense of food security that you speak about, but connected to food sovereignty, and it's about people deciding what matters to them, and then it's also about autonomy, having communities making autonomous decisions about what kind of food they're able to have, because more and more we actually see that there is mega the big agricultural industries.
Industrialization, yeah.
Exactly. And then this has also come with genetically modified, seeds that are being used, which in itself threatens ways in people have known of producing food, of having food that is healthy, of actually connecting even to the spiritual and to land in ways that are, I don't know, personal, and in ways that are also related to the spiritual. And I say this because the connection to land is something that is deeply political and deeply spiritual, particularly for many people. Maybe I'll speak for myself and maybe for communities that we work with. The connection to land is something that is deeply spiritual. And the connection even to the kind of food that people are able to have and what that food looks like is also something about identity. It's also something about, the security that comes with, with it.
Yes, and you mentioned earlier ecofeminism as part of this sort of puzzle, how to bring back or to take back the agency and to also raise the awareness of these differences between food security and food sovereignty and what's at stake when it comes to depriving people of their agency and their possibilities to have their own agriculture as has worked for many thousands of years.
Exactly.
Yeah. So many of the alternatives that we want to discuss and methods are linked to that very interesting word of development, right? Development is a complex thing because, of course, we want to develop, we want to strive, we want to grow, we want to understand things better. But on the other hand, there is this industrialization thing, or the high dependency on tech, which is going on right now, the technical and AI revolution that goes on. And so many people hope that this technology will solve all the issues that we have on climate change and food security or whatever. But could you please also elaborate on WoMin? You address, of course, the difficulties that comes with the capitalist system, the fossil fuel dependency that is linked to extractivism and mining. What kind of other alternatives can you see beyond, because we need to rephrase the narrative now. We need to be creative and find out new ways. What other ways can you share with us?
Okay. So we cannot deny that mining is something that has been happening in our communities even before colonialism. However, when we look at mining at the scale at which it's being done right now, it's mining that is industrial mining. So in terms of defining alternatives, I think one of the key things that we need to think about is people's livelihoods, and also the people who are most affected defining what alternatives look like or what kind of development they would want within their communities. I think more often than not, we've found the narrative around development being brought to people to say, this is what development looks like. Communities have no voice. And I'll also speak about women in this context because women's voices are also not part of the development narrative. And yet, in most communities that we find, women are the people who are who are responsible for the day-to-day, you know, for the day-to-day upkeep of families. They are responsible for producing food. They are responsible for ensuring that there is, you know, families are kept together. So when we talk about development and when we talk about what alternatives look like, in our work as women, we understand that women need to be in the forefront, or the people who are most affected and impacted are the ones who need to be in the forefront in terms of defining what development and how that development can come by. We are in a context where most of our governments are in debt. The Africa Rising narrative also says mining is the way to go. So we are seeing extractivism at unprecedented levels. And then that extractivism in itself has left us in a situation where we have a climate crisis that is hogging us right now. But who are the people who are most impacted by this climate crisis? So development should be development that people are able to recognize, people are able to you know, to define and say, I am the person who has to walk long distances because of mining happening in this community. I'm the person who has to deal with the seepages from chemicals, and women are having stillbirths. So what does development look like for me? Maybe development means we do not need mining at all in our communities. Or maybe development means we look at small artisanal mining and, you know, protection measures for small artisanal miners, and seeing how that can be used to actually benefit communities, as opposed to the kind of development that we are being sold, where communities get to benefit nothing. Social services are unavailable in most communities. The communities where mining is happening right now are the most poorest communities. Women have no access to clinics. Our children have to walk 10 or 15 kilometers to get to schools. So, and there's no food security in these communities as well. So it's actually really important that the people who are most impacted are the ones who get to define the kind of development that they need from you know, and what it should look like.
Yes, it's a very interesting context, because much of the so-called green transition that is going on now, and we're moving towards electric cars, etc., it's so dependent on mining. And even in Sweden now we have a context where we will start so many new mines, and all the governments are super happy about this, and those who pays the price for this are of course minorities who are forcibly displaced, and also women and children who are affected in a way that is not measured on the levels that we have for measurements in BNI. You mentioned one woman needs to fetch water and walk a much longer distance. That's not even measured in a country's BNI. So, of course, these unmeasurable values are highly at stake and makes the vulnerable groups even more vulnerable. What kind of other alternatives now? We have talked about food sovereignty, we have talked about ecofeminism. Now we're into this kind of very interesting area on inventing or creating new alternatives for economic structures. We need to phase out the capitalism and the patriarchy. What do you see? What kind of alternatives can feminism and the solidarity movement and the activist movement for human rights and for climate, how can we ally, and how can we invent these new structures?
We need to dismantle. Systems of oppression, systems that give certain people and certain individuals more power over others, systems that are oppressing nature, about oppressing nature. And when you look at the capitalist system, in its, you know, it's about exploiting nature, it's about exploiting people. So capitalism has to go. So we need to dismantle capitalism. But this is, I guess, it's one of those things where we say, how do we dismantle capitalism? How do we think about these alternatives related to dismantling capitalism? Maybe we need to go back to the communes, what does it mean to build the communes? What does it mean to have communal, what does it mean to build communes? And I think these are some of the conversations that we need to be thinking about. More and more, I've realized that we have gone into spaces where the individualization of struggles, the individualization of, which is very divisive. So now now more than ever, we need to be thinking about collective struggles. How do we come together? How do we build collective political consciousness around the structures of inequality that exist in our society, that exist in our, how do we come together across, across continents, across borders, to actually fight this big monster. And like you did highlight, right now we have 4 solutions, such as the green extractivism. And I think green extractivism is going to build up at the expense of the minorities, at the expense of poor people. And then we are being told that this is for development, but it's for development for those who are already rich, for those. We are developing people who are already developed at the cost of the underdeveloped, who continue to feed the development of the already developed. And then we also find that our climate crisis continues. Right now, just to give an example, Africa finds itself contributing 3% of carbon emissions. And yet, Africa is the one that is heavily affected and impacted by the climate crisis. And we need to do something about that. And I think our governments also need to do something about that. Other 4 solutions, such as COP actually have to go. Because COP in itself is a platform where big companies are actually lobbying our governments. Oh my goodness. Big companies are actually lobbying our governments to, it's a space that's not about the voices of the people who are most impacted and affected. It's a space that is actually advancing the interests of multinationals at the expense of people.
So we got a message here. There are 3 more minutes to go, but we've covered some of their alternatives. And I know that from a previous conversation today, you said that more or less no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. And I think maybe that's one of the messages when it comes to this. What we need to do now is some kind of global solidarity movement. We have to be both local and global at the same time. And we have the possibilities. Let's use this AI and tech to the advantage of people's power. But can you give us another message from people to people, from Southern Africa to Swedish context, that you wish the audience to take with them when they go home tonight?
Okay, thank you. I think the other last thing that I would say is, as we think about this, can we also think about how our companies, how our governments are also contributing to murders, rape of women in the different contexts? Because some of our money is financing, all these atrocities in our different countries. So, for example, the Swedish pension fund money, there's money that is actually going towards funding mining and extraction in different countries where and there's war there, and then there are people that are being killed and there are women that are being raped. So we also need to follow our money, and we also need to be putting pressure on our governments in terms of, And then lastly, I think more and more, we should be pushing for our governments to recognize the climate crisis and also their contribution, particularly the Global North's contribution to the climate crisis. I know we now have more and more right-wing leaders, and it's becoming more and more difficult to do this. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. So important messages. And if you want to join our struggle against the Swedish AP funds investments in, for instance, Cabo Delgado in northern Mozambique, you can go into a website called vianmälerapfonderna.se. It's a submission to the Human Rights Commission on the violations of human rights and environment that some of the organizations here at MR-dagarna has joined in. So thank you so much, Winnet, for sharing these amazing things and disturbing things, and thank you to the audience who came. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Okay, I was wondering.